The morning sun cast long shadows across the airfield as Maria Volkov adjusted her leather helmet one final time. At 23, she looked like any other mechanic working on the Soviet aircraft scattered around the base. Her grease-stained coveralls and dirt-smudged face gave no hint of the secret she carried. The other mechanics called her Little Mouse because of her quiet nature and small frame. They had no idea that beneath those baggy clothes was one of the most skilled pilots in the entire Soviet Air Force. Maria had learned to fly before she could properly drive a car. Her father, a crop duster in rural Ukraine, had taken her up in his rickety biplane when she was just 8 years old. By 14, she was secretly flying solo missions while her father thought she was just cleaning the aircraft. The feel of the controls, the dance between machine and sky, the pure freedom of flight. It all came as naturally to her as breathing. When the war began, Maria tried to enlist as a pilot 3 times. Each time the recruiters laughed her out of the office. Women belong in factories, not fighter planes, they told her. Leave the flying to the men. But Maria had a plan. She cut her hair short, bound her chest, and adopted her deceased brother's identity. Viktor Volkov, according to the forged papers she carried, was a promising young pilot from a small farming village. The deception worked perfectly at first. Military life was brutal for everyone, so her quiet demeanor didn't stand out. She kept to herself during training, always volunteering for extra maintenance duty to avoid the communal showers. Her flying skills, however, were impossible to hide. During training exercises, Victor consistently outperformed pilots with twice the experience. Her instructors attributed it to natural talent and farm boy determination. The other cadets respected her flying but found her strange. She never joined their evening drinking sessions or talked about girls back home. Some whispered that Victor was either deeply religious or had seen too much death in his village. Maria encouraged these rumors. They kept people from asking too many questions about her past. Commander Alexei Petrov noticed the quiet cadet from the beginning. There was something different about Viktor Volkov, something that went beyond exceptional flying ability. The way the young pilot moved, the careful attention to detail, the almost maternal care shown toward the aircraft, it all seemed unusual for a typical farm boy. But Petrov kept his suspicions to himself. Good pilots were desperately needed, and Victor was the best natural flyer he had seen in 20 years of service. Maria's biggest challenge wasn't learning to fly military aircraft or mastering combat tactics. It was maintaining her disguise while living in close quarters with dozens of men. She perfected a deeper voice and adopted masculine mannerisms she had observed in her brother. She learned to walk with longer strides, to sit with her legs spread wide, to spit casually like the other soldiers. Every moment required careful attention to detail. The physical demands of pilot training helped her maintain the illusion. The intense exercise and rationed food kept her naturally slight frame even thinner. The standard-issue flight suit was baggy enough to hide her figure completely. She wrapped her torso with strips of cloth each morning, a painful but necessary part of her daily routine. During night training flights, Maria felt most like herself. Alone in the cockpit, thousands of feet above the sleeping countryside, she could drop the exhausting pretense of being Victor. She would pull off her helmet and let the wind whip through her short hair. These stolen moments of freedom kept her sane during the grueling months of training. Her scores in aerial gunnery were exceptional. While other cadets struggled with the complex calculations needed for deflection shooting, Maria seemed to understand instinctively where to aim. She could place bullets exactly where she wanted them, whether shooting at ground targets or trailing sleeve targets pulled by other aircraft. Her instructors began using her demonstrations to teach other students proper shooting technique. The deception nearly failed during a medical examination. The base doctor, an elderly man with thick glasses, noticed some unusual physical characteristics during Victor's routine physical. Maria held her breath as he examined her throat and chest, certain that discovery was inevitable. But the doctor, focused on checking for tuberculosis and other diseases common among the troops, simply noted that the young pilot had unusually smooth skin and a light voice, perhaps due to a childhood illness. As graduation approached, Maria faced a new challenge. The top pilots in her class were being assigned to elite fighter squadrons on the front lines. This was exactly what she wanted, but it also meant closer scrutiny from commanding officers and more experienced pilots. Any mistake in maintaining her disguise could result in immediate court-martial and execution as a spy. The night before graduation, Maria sat alone in the empty hangar, staring at the fighter aircraft that would soon carry her into combat. She ran her hand along the smooth metal of the wing, feeling the rivets and curves that had become as familiar as her own body. Tomorrow she would officially become a combat pilot. She had successfully fooled the entire Soviet military system, but the real test was just beginning. Commander Petrov found her there an hour before dawn. He sat down beside her without speaking, both of them watching the sunrise paint the aircraft in shades of gold and red. After several minutes of comfortable silence, he spoke quietly. "Whatever secrets you carry, Victor, make sure they don't get you killed up there. Good pilots are too valuable to lose to anything except enemy bullets." Maria nodded, not trusting her voice. Did he know? Was this a warning or just general advice? She couldn't tell. But something in his tone suggested that Petrov suspected more than he was saying. Either way, there was no turning back now. In a few hours, she would receive her assignment and finally have the chance to prove that she belonged in the sky, fighting for her country alongside the best pilots in the Soviet Air Force. The graduation ceremony was simple and brief. Names were called, assignments were handed out, and new combat pilots saluted their commanding officers before heading to their assigned squadrons. When Viktor Volkov received orders to report to the 123rd Fighter Regiment on the Ukrainian front, Maria felt her heart racing with excitement and terror. She was finally going to war, carrying a secret that could destroy her but armed with skills that might help turn the tide of battle. The 123rd Fighter Regiment was stationed at a makeshift airfield, carved out of a wheat field 30 kilometers behind the front lines. Maria arrived on a supply truck during a thunderstorm, her duffel bag soaked and her boots caked with mud. The base consisted of a few wooden buildings, some tents and aircraft parked under camouflage netting. Everything looked temporary, as if the entire operation might disappear at a moment's notice. Squadron leader Dmitry Kozlov was a battle-hardened veteran with graying temples and tired eyes. He had been flying combat missions since the war began, and the strain showed in every line of his weathered face. When he met the new pilot, he looked Victor up and down with obvious skepticism. "You look like a strong wind could blow you away, farm boy. Flying training aircraft is different from dodging German bullets. Out here, mistakes get you killed fast." The other pilots in the squadron were a mixed group of veterans and recent graduates. Most had already seen combat and lost friends to enemy fighters or ground fire. They welcomed new pilots with cautious friendliness, knowing that half of all rookie pilots didn't survive their first month of combat flying. They called the newcomers fresh meat and made bets on how long each one would last. Maria's bunk was in a crowded barracks with 11 other pilots. The sleeping arrangements were primitive, canvas cots separated by thin wooden partitions that provided little privacy. She learned to change clothes quickly and quietly, always waiting until the others were asleep or away from the barracks. Her wrapped chest made sleeping uncomfortable, but she didn't dare remove the bindings even while sleeping. The aircraft were Yak-1 fighters, fast and maneuverable but lightly armored. Each plane carried a single 20mm cannon and 2 machine guns, enough firepower to destroy enemy aircraft if the pilot could get close enough to hit them. Maria spent hours studying every detail of her assigned aircraft, memorizing the location of every switch and gauge. She named her plane Little Sparrow, but kept the name to herself. Combat missions began immediately. The regiment flew patrol flights over the front lines, escorted bombers attacking German positions, and intercepted enemy aircraft attempting to attack Soviet ground forces. During her first week, Maria flew 12 sorties without seeing a single enemy plane. The missions were tense but uneventful. Long hours of scanning empty skies while her fuel gauge slowly dropped toward the red zone. The other pilots began to notice Victor's exceptional flying skills during training flights. While most pilots struggled to maintain formation in bad weather or during aggressive maneuvers, the quiet newcomer seemed to anticipate every air current and wind shift. His aircraft always stayed perfectly positioned, never sliding out of formation or requiring power adjustments to keep up. Veteran pilots with hundreds of combat hours found themselves working hard to match Victor's smooth, effortless flying. Maria's biggest advantage was her size. At just over 5 feet tall and weighing barely 100 pounds, she could handle the extreme physical stresses of aerial combat better than larger pilots. When her aircraft pulled sharp turns at high speed, The tremendous gravitational forces that left bigger men gasping for breath barely affected her. She could maintain consciousness and continue fighting in situations that would incapacitate other pilots. Her gunnery skills also stood out during training exercises. The regiment used a practice range where pilots fired at ground targets while flying at high speed and low altitude. Most pilots needed dozens of practice runs to consistently hit the targets. Victor managed perfect scores after just 3 attempts, placing bullets exactly where he aimed, despite the aircraft's vibration and the difficulty of shooting while pulling high-speed maneuvers. Commander Kozlov began assigning Victor to increasingly important missions. First, he flew wingman to experienced pilots during bomber escort duties. Then he was given independent patrol missions over quiet sectors of the front. His reports were always accurate and detailed, noting enemy aircraft positions, ground activity, and weather conditions with the precision of a veteran observer. The other pilots started calling Victor Ghost because of his ability to appear and disappear during training dogfights. He seemed to know instinctively where enemy aircraft would be, arriving at exactly the right moment to attack from an unexpected angle. During mock combat exercises, even veteran pilots found themselves outmaneuvered by the quiet farm boy, who never bragged about his victories or criticized others for their mistakes. Maria's closest call during this period had nothing to do with combat flying. During a maintenance inspection, a mechanic noticed that Victor's parachute harness had been modified in an unusual way. The standard harness was designed for the average male pilot, but Victor had quietly adjusted the straps and padding to fit his smaller frame. When questioned about the modifications, Maria explained that her unusual build required custom adjustments for safety. The mechanic accepted this explanation, but filed a report noting the irregularities. Squadron leader Kozlov read the mechanic's report with growing suspicion. Added to his other observations about Victor, the smooth skin, the high voice, the careful attention to personal hygiene, the refusal to join group activities, the parachute modifications suggested possibilities that he didn't want to consider. If Victor was who Kozlov suspected, the implications were enormous. But the pilot's combat potential was too valuable to risk losing over unproven suspicions. The war was going badly for the Soviet Union. German forces had advanced deep into Russian territory, and every experienced pilot was desperately needed. Kozlov decided to watch Victor closely, but take no action unless he had definitive proof. As long as the mysterious pilot continued flying effective missions and destroying enemy aircraft, personal secrets could wait. Maria sensed the increased scrutiny, but couldn't identify its source. She noticed that Kozlov seemed to watch her more carefully during briefings and debriefings. Other pilots occasionally made comments that seemed to have double meanings. The constant stress of maintaining her disguise, combined with the pressure of combat flying, began to take its toll. She lost weight and started having trouble sleeping, even during the brief periods when exhaustion should have made rest automatic. The breakthrough came during a mission that was supposed to be routine. Victor was assigned to fly a reconnaissance mission over German-held territory, photographing enemy positions and counting aircraft at a forward airfield. It was the kind of mission usually given to new pilots, important but relatively safe, with little chance of encountering enemy fighters. Maria took off alone in the early morning, flying east toward the rising sun. The landscape below was scarred with trenches, bomb craters, and the burned remains of villages caught in the fighting. She flew at medium altitude, high enough to avoid ground fire, but low enough to get clear photographs of the targets she had been assigned to investigate. She was photographing a German supply depot when she spotted movement in the distance. 6 aircraft were climbing toward her position, their distinctive silhouettes identifying them as Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters. They had spotted her reconnaissance flight and were moving to intercept. Maria found herself alone, outnumbered 6-1 with nowhere to run and no help coming. The secret she had carried for months was about to be tested in the most deadly way possible. Maria's training took over as the 6 German fighters closed in on her position. Her father had taught her that panic was a pilot's worst enemy, that clear thinking and smooth control movements were the only things that separated the living from the dead. She pushed the throttle forward and began a gentle turn toward home, trying to look like a frightened reconnaissance pilot running for safety. The German formation was climbing fast, but they were still several thousand feet below her. Their leader was clearly experienced. directing his fighters to spread out and cut off her escape routes. Maria calculated distances and climbing rates in her head, realizing that she might be able to reach friendly territory before they caught her if she played this perfectly. But that would mean running from a fight, something that went against every instinct she had developed as a pilot. Instead of running, Maria made a decision that would have seemed insane to any reasonable pilot. She turned directly toward the approaching German fighters and pushed her Yak-1 into a steep diving attack. The enemy pilots, expecting her to flee, were caught completely off guard as the lone Soviet aircraft came screaming down at them from above. Maria selected the trailing fighter as her first target. The German pilot was focused on his squadron leader and didn't see the attack coming until tracers started flashing past his cockpit. She fired a short burst from her cannon and machine guns, aiming carefully for the engine compartment. The shells struck home with devastating effect, and the Messerschmitt's engine burst into flames. The German pilot bailed out immediately, his parachute blossoming as his aircraft spiraled toward the ground. The other 5 fighters scattered in confusion, trying to locate their attacker and figure out what had happened to their wingman. Maria used their momentary disorganization to climb back up above them, positioning herself for another attack. She had learned from studying veteran pilots that altitude was life in aerial combat. The pilot with the height advantage could choose when and how to fight. The German squadron leader finally spotted her and began climbing aggressively, firing long bursts from his weapons in an attempt to drive her away. Maria waited until he committed to his attack, then rolled inverted and pulled her aircraft into a split-S maneuver that took her diving past his line of fire. As she pulled out of the dive, she found herself directly behind another German fighter, whose pilot was still looking for her in the wrong direction. Her second burst was even more accurate than the first. The cannon shells tore through the Messerschmitt's wing route, severing control cables and fuel lines. The German aircraft immediately went into an uncontrollable spin, trailing smoke and pieces of torn metal. Maria didn't see the pilot escape before his fighter disappeared into a cloud bank far below. Now the odds were 4 against 1, but the German pilots had lost their initial confidence. They had expected to quickly dispatch a lone reconnaissance aircraft and return to base with an easy victory. Instead, they had lost 2 experienced pilots to an enemy who seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost, striking from impossible angles and vanishing before they could respond effectively. Maria climbed again, using the superior performance of her Yak-1 at high altitude to stay above the German formation. The Messerschmitts were faster in level flight and had better diving speed, but her aircraft could outclimb them and turn more tightly in sustained combat. She planned to use these advantages to pick off the remaining German fighters one by one. The enemy squadron leader was getting desperate. His carefully planned intercept had turned into a disaster, and he needed to destroy the Soviet pilot before more of his men were killed. He ordered his remaining fighters to climb in a loose formation, hoping to trap their opponent between multiple attackers and overwhelm her with concentrated firepower. Maria saw the trap being set and responded with a maneuver that would become her trademark in future battles. Instead of trying to escape or climb higher, she rolled her aircraft inverted and pulled into a vertical dive that took her straight through the center of the German formation. The enemy pilots, flying in close formation and focused on maintaining their positions, had no time to react as she flashed between them at tremendous speed. As she passed through their formation, Maria fired at the closest Messerschmitt, hitting it in the fuel tank with a burst from her cannon. The German fighter exploded in a ball of orange flame, sending burning debris in all directions. One piece of wreckage struck another German aircraft, damaging its propeller and forcing the pilot to break off the engagement and head for home with his engine running roughly. That left 2 German fighters still in the fight, but their formation was completely broken, and their leader was beginning to panic. He had started this engagement with overwhelming numerical superiority and the expectation of an easy victory. Now half his squadron was destroyed or disabled, and he still hadn't managed to hit the Soviet pilot who was systematically destroying his formation. Maria climbed once more, but this time the 2 remaining German pilots were ready for her. They separated widely, forcing her to choose which one to attack while leaving herself exposed to fire from the other. She selected the squadron leader as her target, reasoning that removing him might cause the last fighter to withdraw rather than continue the battle alone. The German leader was skilled and experienced. turning to meet her attack head-on rather than trying to escape. Both aircraft fired simultaneously as they closed at a combined speed of nearly 600 miles per hour. Tracers crisscrossed between them, and Maria felt bullets striking her aircraft as she pressed her own attack home. Her cannon shells hit the Messerschmitt's cockpit area, and she saw the German pilot slump forward over his controls. The enemy fighter rolled slowly to the left and began a gentle dive toward the ground, its engine still running but no longer under human control. Maria watched it disappear into the haze below, carrying its dead pilot toward an anonymous grave in the Ukrainian countryside. The last German fighter had seen enough. His squadron leader was dead, 3 other pilots had been shot down, and 1 aircraft was limping home with damage. The lone Soviet pilot who had caused all this destruction was still flying, and apparently undamaged despite the intense combat. The surviving German pilot turned for home without attempting another attack, leaving Maria alone in the sky above the battlefield. She took a moment to assess the damage to her own aircraft. Several bullets had struck the fuselage and wings, but nothing vital had been hit. The engine was running smoothly, all controls responded normally, and her fuel supply was adequate for the flight home. She had survived her first real aerial combat, not only intact but victorious against impossible odds. Maria resumed her reconnaissance mission, photographing the targets she had been assigned while staying alert for more enemy aircraft. The German supply depot was exactly where intelligence reports had indicated, with trucks and fuel tanks clearly visible. She took detailed photographs that would help Soviet artillery target the facility for destruction. The flight home gave her time to think about what had just happened. In 20 minutes of combat, she had single-handedly destroyed 4 German fighters and damaged a 5th, while surviving attacks from 6 experienced enemy pilots. It was the kind of victory that veteran aces achieved only rarely, yet she had accomplished it during her first real air battle. More importantly, she had proven to herself that her skills were not just adequate for combat flying, they were exceptional. All the doubts and fears about whether a woman could succeed as a fighter pilot had been answered definitively. She belonged in the cockpit, fighting for her country alongside the best pilots in the Soviet Air Force. The secret she carried was no longer a source of shame or anxiety. It was simply an irrelevant detail about a pilot who could outfight anyone the enemy could send against her. When Maria landed back at the base, a crowd of mechanics and pilots gathered around her aircraft to examine the bullet holes in the wings and fuselage. Squadron leader Kozlov personally inspected the damage while she delivered her mission report. Her voice remained steady as she described the encounter with 6 German fighters, but her hand shook slightly as she traced the enemy aircraft positions on the mission map. "You're telling me you shot down 4 Messerschmitts and damaged a 5th?" Kozlov asked, his voice carefully neutral. "In your first combat engagement? Against 6 experienced German pilots?" Maria nodded, pointing to the camera mounted in her aircraft. "The gun camera footage will show everything. I also completed the reconnaissance mission and brought back photographs of the supply depot." She handed over the film canisters with the same matter-of-fact tone she had used to report routine training flights. The other pilots exchanged glances but said nothing. Rookie pilots sometimes exaggerated their combat claims, reporting damaged aircraft as destroyed or counting the same enemy fighter multiple times. But the gun camera would provide definitive proof of Victor's claims. If the footage confirmed his story, they were looking at one of the most remarkable aerial victories of the war. The film was developed immediately and screened in the squadron briefing room. Even projected on a small screen, the footage was unmistakably authentic. The camera recorded every moment of the engagement, from the initial diving attack to the final destruction of the German squadron leader. The pilots watched in stunned silence as Victor systematically dismantled an entire enemy formation with flying that bordered on supernatural. "Sweet Mother of God," whispered Captain Pavel Antonov, a veteran pilot with 15 confirmed victories. "I've never seen anything like that. The way he threaded through their formation, that should have been suicide." How did he know they wouldn't hit him? Commander Kozlov studied the footage frame by frame, looking for any sign of luck or accident in Victor's victory. What he saw was calculated precision, each maneuver perfectly timed and executed. The rookie pilot had demonstrated tactical awareness that most pilots took years to develop. More troubling was the almost intuitive way Victor seemed to anticipate enemy reactions and position. his aircraft for maximum advantage. The news of Victor's victory spread quickly through the regiment and beyond. 5 confirmed kills in a single engagement was the kind of achievement that earned immediate promotion and official recognition. Within hours, reporters from the Army newspaper arrived to interview the hero pilot and write stories about the farm boy who had humbled the German Luftwaffe. Maria found the attention terrifying. Each interview and photograph increased the risk that someone would recognize her true identity. She tried to keep her answers brief and avoid personal details, but the reporters were persistent. They wanted to know about her childhood, her family, her dreams, and motivations. Every question was a potential trap that could expose her deception. The official award ceremony took place 3 days later. Viktor Volkov was promoted to lieutenant and awarded the Order of the Red Star for exceptional courage in combat. As she stood at attention while the medal was pinned to her uniform, Maria felt the weight of hundreds of eyes studying her face. Any one of the assembled officers might recognize something that would reveal her secret. More dangerous than the publicity was the increased scrutiny from her fellow pilots. They began studying Victor's flying techniques more carefully, trying to understand how he had achieved such remarkable success. Some asked detailed questions about his training and background, probing for the source of his exceptional skills. Others simply watched him constantly, looking for any clue that might explain his mysterious abilities. Captain Antonov became particularly interested in Victor's background. He had been flying combat missions since the war began, and considered himself an expert at reading other pilots. Something about the quiet newcomer didn't match the official story of a farm boy from rural Ukraine. The way Victor moved, the careful attention to personal hygiene, the reluctance to discuss his past, all of it suggested secrets that went deeper than simple rural modesty. Maria began varying her daily routines to avoid creating patterns that might be observed and analyzed. She ate meals at different times, took different routes between buildings, and avoided spending too much time in any single location. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but any relaxation of her guard could lead to discovery and execution as a spy. The pressure increased when she was assigned to fly with different wingmen on each mission. This rotation was supposedly for tactical reasons, but Maria suspected that Kozlov was testing her flying skills against various experienced pilots. Each new partner brought fresh eyes and different perspectives, increasing the chances that someone would notice inconsistencies in her behavior or flying style. Her next major combat engagement came 2 weeks after the first. Victor was assigned to escort a formation of bomber aircraft attacking a German airfield deep behind enemy lines. The mission was considered highly dangerous, with strong enemy fighter opposition expected. Only the most experienced pilots were normally given such assignments, but Victor's proven combat record had earned him a place in the elite formation. The bomber formation consisted of 12 Il-2 attack aircraft loaded with bombs and rockets. They flew at low altitude to avoid radar detection, skimming just above the treetops as they approached their target. Maria flew top cover with 5 other fighters, watching for enemy interceptors while the bombers prepared for their attack run. The German response was swift and overwhelming. As the Soviet formation approached the target airfield, 2 squadrons of enemy fighters rose to meet them. 24 Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulf fighters climbed rapidly, preparing to slash through the bomber formation and destroy as many aircraft as possible before the Soviets could complete their mission. Squadron leader Kozlov ordered his fighters to engage the enemy while the bombers continued to their target. The 6 Soviet fighters turned toward the approaching German formation, flying directly into odds of 4-1. Maria found herself once again outnumbered and fighting for her life. But this time she had experienced wingmen beside her and a vital mission to protect. The air battle that followed was savage and chaotic. Aircraft dove and climbed through a 3-dimensional maze of tracers and explosions, pilots pushing their machines to the absolute limits of performance. Maria quickly lost track of her assigned wingman in the swirling combat, finding herself alone again but surrounded by targets of opportunity. She selected a Focke-Wulf that was diving toward the bomber formation and turned to intercept it. The German pilot saw her coming and tried to evade, but Maria anticipated his maneuver and adjusted her aim accordingly. Her cannon shells struck the enemy fighter's engine, and it exploded in a shower of burning fuel and metal fragments. Before she could celebrate the victory, tracers flashed past her cockpit from behind. A Messerschmitt had gotten on her tail and was trying to line up a killing shot. Maria threw her aircraft into a violent barrel roll, using the yak's superior agility to stay ahead of the enemy's fire. The German pilot was skilled and persistent, matching her maneuvers and gradually closing the distance between them. Maria needed help, but when she looked around for her wingman, she saw only enemy aircraft. The other Soviet fighters were scattered across the sky, each engaged in individual battles for survival. The bomber formation was under heavy attack, with several Il-2s already trailing smoke or falling toward the ground in flames. If the fighter escort couldn't turn the tide quickly, the entire mission would end in disaster. She made another decision that would have seemed impossible to any rational pilot. Instead of continuing to evade the Messerschmitt on her tail, Maria suddenly chopped her throttle and deployed her landing flaps. Her aircraft slowed so abruptly that the pursuing German fighter shot past her before its pilot could react. In the space of 3 seconds, Maria had transformed from hunted prey into predator, with a perfect shot at her former pursuer. Her burst was brief, but deadly accurate. The Messerschmitt's cockpit disintegrated under the impact of her cannon shells, and the aircraft tumbled out of control toward the ground below. Maria retracted her flaps and pushed her throttle forward, climbing back into the battle with her second victory of the engagement secured. The combat continued for another 10 minutes, with aircraft falling on both sides. When the surviving German fighters finally withdrew to rearm and refuel, the sky was littered with parachutes and burning wreckage. Maria had shot down 3 enemy fighters and helped drive off the attackers, allowing most of the bomber formation to complete their mission and return safely to base. The return flight to base was somber despite the mission's success. 3 Soviet fighters had been lost, including Captain Antonov, whose aircraft had been seen exploding during the chaotic air battle. His loss hit the squadron hard. He had been both a skilled pilot and a natural leader who helped younger pilots adapt to the deadly realities of aerial combat. Maria felt the weight of survival guilt as she landed her battle-damaged aircraft. She had emerged from another impossible situation not only alive but victorious, while better pilots had died around her. The other survivors looked at her with a mixture of respect and something approaching fear. Victor's combat record was becoming legendary, but his consistent success in situations where others died was starting to seem almost supernatural. Squadron leader Kozlov called Victor into his office that evening for a private debriefing. The commander's questions were more personal than usual, focusing on Victor's feelings about combat and his relationships with other pilots. Maria sensed that she was being evaluated for something beyond standard pilot performance, but she couldn't determine what Kozlov was really trying to discover. "You show no fear," Kozlov observed, studying Victor's face carefully. "Most pilots, even experienced ones, show some emotional reaction after intense combat. You seem completely unaffected by killing enemy pilots or watching your comrades die. Is this natural for you, or have you learned to control your emotions?" Maria chose her words carefully. "Fear is a luxury I cannot afford, sir. When German fighters are shooting at me, there is no time for anything except flying and fighting. The emotions come later, when I am alone." It was an honest answer that revealed nothing about her true identity while explaining her apparent detachment during combat. Kozlov nodded slowly. "Captain Antonov spoke to me before his death. He had theories about your background that went beyond your official records. He believed you were hiding something significant about your past." The commander paused, watching for any reaction. I told him that a pilot's secrets were less important than his combat effectiveness. "Do you agree with that assessment?" "I believe results speak louder than speculation, sir," Maria replied. "My gun camera footage documents my contributions to the squadron. Everything else is just talk." She met Kozlov's gaze steadily, neither confirming nor denying the suspicions that were clearly circulating among the surviving pilots. The conversation ended without resolution, but Maria understood that her secret was becoming harder to maintain. Antonov's death had eliminated one source of dangerous questions, but others were beginning to notice the inconsistencies in Victor's behavior and background. She needed to be even more careful about maintaining her disguise while continuing to fly combat missions effectively. The war situation was changing rapidly. German forces had been stopped short of Moscow and were beginning to retreat in some sectors. Soviet aircraft were flying more aggressive missions, attacking enemy positions deeper behind the lines, and engaging in large-scale air battles with experienced German pilots. The 123rd Fighter Regiment was reassigned to support a major offensive operation that would require extended flights over heavily defended territory. Victor was promoted to senior lieutenant and given command of a 4-aircraft flight within the squadron. This meant responsibility for 3 other pilots, including 2 rookies fresh from training school. Maria found herself in the strange position of mentoring new pilots while still struggling to maintain her own false identity. She had to teach others the flying techniques that came naturally to her while avoiding any behavior that might seem maternal or feminine. Her flight was assigned to provide escort for reconnaissance aircraft photographing German defensive positions. These missions were particularly dangerous because they required flying at predictable altitudes and speeds, while enemy fighters tried to intercept them. The reconnaissance pilots depended completely on their fighter escorts for survival, making any failure of protection a potential disaster. During their 3rd escort mission, Maria's flight encountered a formation of 8 German fighters led by a pilot, whose aircraft bore the distinctive markings of an experienced ace. The enemy formation was well organized and aggressive, clearly commanded by someone who understood aerial tactics and had the skill to execute complex maneuvers under combat conditions. The engagement began with the classic head-on pass, both formations flying directly at each other, while firing at maximum range. Maria led her flight in a slight climb, trying to gain altitude advantage while keeping the reconnaissance aircraft within protective range. The German formation split into 2 elements, attempting to divide the Soviet fighters and create opportunities for attacks on the vulnerable reconnaissance planes. Maria ordered her wingmen to stay with the reconnaissance aircraft while she and her element leader turned to engage the climbing German fighters. It was a calculated risk that left the photo planes protected by only 2 fighters, but she judged it necessary to prevent the enemy from gaining the altitude advantage that would allow them to attack at will. The German ace proved to be exceptionally skilled, using his formation's superior numbers to execute complex tactical maneuvers that should have overwhelmed the outnumbered Soviet pilots. Maria found herself fighting the most challenging aerial opponent she had yet encountered, a pilot whose skills matched her own, and whose experience showed in every tactical decision. The battle raged across several thousand feet of altitude, as both formations climbed and dove in deadly spirals. Maria shot down 2 German fighters in quick succession, but her element leader was hit and forced to withdraw with his engine smoking. That left her alone against 6 enemy aircraft, including the ace who seemed determined to prove his superiority against the legendary Soviet pilot. For the first time since beginning combat flying, Maria found herself in serious trouble. The German ace was anticipating her maneuvers and positioning his fighters to cut off her escape routes. His tactical awareness was extraordinary, and he commanded his formation with the precision of a veteran who had survived hundreds of combat missions. Maria tried her signature diving attack through the enemy formation, but the German leader had studied her previous engagements and was ready for the maneuver. As she dove toward his fighters, they scattered in a predetermined pattern that left her exposed to crossfire from multiple directions. Tracers filled the air around her aircraft, and she felt bullets striking her wings and fuselage. Her engine began running roughly, and she noticed the oil pressure gauge dropping toward the red zone. The German ace had damaged her aircraft more seriously than she initially realized, and her options for continued combat were rapidly disappearing. She needed to disengage and return to base before her engine failed completely, but the enemy fighters were positioned to intercept any attempt at withdrawal. The reconnaissance aircraft she was supposed to protect were still completing their photography mission, circling slowly over the German positions, while her 2 remaining wingmen tried to keep enemy fighters away from them. Maria realized that abandoning her protective mission would leave the photo planes defenseless and probably result in their destruction. She had to continue fighting despite her damaged aircraft and deteriorating tactical situation. Instead of trying to escape, Maria turned directly toward the German ace's aircraft and began firing at maximum range. Her damaged engine couldn't produce full power, but her cannon and machine guns were still functional. The enemy pilot seemed surprised by her aggressive response to his tactical advantage and momentarily hesitated in his attack. That moment of hesitation was all Maria needed. She used her aircraft's superior turning ability, to reverse their relative positions, putting the German ace on the defensive for the first time in the engagement. Her cannon shells struck his aircraft's wing root, causing visible damage and forcing him to break off his attack. The other German fighters, seeing their leader in trouble, moved to assist him, but left themselves vulnerable to Maria's counterattack. She shot down a third German fighter as it climbed to help its squadron leader, then damaged another so badly that it was forced to withdraw from the battle. The odds were finally becoming manageable, but her engine was getting worse. White smoke was beginning to stream from her exhaust, and the oil pressure gauge showed almost zero pressure remaining. The German ace rallied his remaining fighters for one final coordinated attack. Maria could see that he was an exceptional pilot and leader, the kind of enemy who made the difference between victory and defeat in aerial combat. If she could eliminate him, the remaining German fighters would probably withdraw. If he succeeded in shooting her down, her wingmen and the reconnaissance aircraft would be at his mercy. Both pilots committed everything to the final engagement. They flew directly at each other in a head-on attack that would determine the outcome of the entire battle. Maria's damaged engine was losing power with each passing second, but her weapons were still accurate and her determination was absolute. The German ace was flying a superior aircraft with full engine power, but he was facing an opponent whose skills had already destroyed half his formation. They fired simultaneously at point-blank range. Maria's cannon shells struck the German fighter's cockpit and engine, while his bullets shattered her windscreen and instrument panel. Both aircraft were critically damaged, but only one pilot remained in control. The German ace's fighter rolled slowly to the left and began a steep dive toward the ground, carrying its mortally wounded pilot to his death. Maria's aircraft was barely flyable, but she managed to maintain level flight long enough to check on her wingmen and the reconnaissance planes. The photo mission had been completed successfully, and the surviving German fighters were withdrawing toward their own territory. She had won another impossible victory, but at a cost that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The flight home tested every skill she had learned as a pilot. Her engine was running on whatever oil remained in the system, producing less than half its normal power. The damaged controls required constant attention to keep the aircraft flying straight and level. Her instruments were mostly destroyed, forcing her to navigate by visual reference to landmarks and the position of the sun. She made it back to base with her engine seizing just as she touched down on the runway. Mechanics who examined the aircraft afterward said it was a miracle that the engine had continued running long enough to bring her home. The damage was so extensive that the aircraft was written off as unrepairable. Its useful life ended by the intensity of aerial combat. Squadron leader Kozlov was waiting for her when she climbed out of the cockpit. His expression was grim as he looked at the bullet holes and battle damage covering every surface of the aircraft. "This is the third time you've come back from an impossible situation," he said quietly. "How long do you think your luck will last?" Maria pulled off her damaged helmet and looked at the wreckage of her aircraft. "Luck has nothing to do with it, sir. I survive because I refuse to give up. As long as there are German fighters in the sky, I will find a way to destroy them." Her voice was steady despite the exhaustion and stress of another deadly encounter. That night, alone in her bunk, Maria finally allowed herself to feel the fear and doubt that she couldn't show during combat. She was pushing her luck with every mission, surviving situations that should have killed her through a combination of skill, determination, and what seemed like supernatural intervention. But she also knew that the war was far from over, and each victory only led to more dangerous missions against increasingly skilled opponents. Her secret identity remained intact, but the constant scrutiny was becoming harder to manage. Other pilots studied her every move, looking for explanations for her impossible success rate. Military intelligence officers were beginning to ask questions about Victor's background that went beyond routine security checks. The fame that came with her victories was becoming as dangerous as the German fighters she faced in combat. 3 days after the encounter with the German ace, Maria received orders that would change everything. She was being transferred to an elite unit commanded directly by the Soviet Air Force headquarters in Moscow. The 1st Guards Fighter Regiment was composed entirely of the highest-scoring pilots in the entire Air Force, men whose combat records had earned them legendary status throughout the military. The transfer came with a promotion to captain and assignment as a flight leader within the Guards Regiment, It was an honor that any pilot would dream of receiving, but for Maria, it represented the ultimate test of her ability to maintain her disguise. She would be working alongside the most experienced and observant pilots in the Soviet Air Force, men who had survived years of combat by developing an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations. Squadron leader Kozlov personally delivered the transfer orders. His expression was unreadable as he handed over the official documents, but Maria detected something that might have been relief in his voice. "You've earned this assignment through exceptional combat performance," he said formally. "The Guards Regiment needs pilots who can achieve results against impossible odds." After a pause, he added more quietly, "Whatever secrets you carry, Victor, they go with you to Moscow. I've recommended you for this position based solely on your combat record. What headquarters chooses to investigate about your background is no longer my concern." The warning was clear. Higher authority would bring closer scrutiny and more dangerous questions. The journey to Moscow took 2 days by military transport. Maria traveled with 3 other pilots who had also been selected for the Guards Regiment, all of them veterans with impressive combat records. During the long train ride, she listened to their stories about famous aces they had known and battles they had survived. Each conversation was a reminder of how much she still had to learn about maintaining her cover among truly elite pilots. Colonel Viktor Petrov commanded the Guards Regiment from an airfield outside Moscow. He was a legendary pilot himself, credited with over 50 aerial victories and known throughout the Soviet Air Force for his tactical brilliance and unwavering loyalty to the Communist Party. When Maria reported for duty, he studied her with the penetrating gaze of a man who had spent years evaluating pilots under the most stressful conditions imaginable. "Your combat record is remarkable for such a young pilot," Petrov observed, reading from Victor's personnel file. 23 confirmed aerial victories in less than 4 months of combat flying. Some of our most experienced aces took years to achieve such numbers. Tell me how you explain this exceptional performance." Maria had prepared for this question during the journey to Moscow. "I believe my success comes from treating each engagement as a mathematical problem rather than an emotional contest. Enemy aircraft follow predictable flight paths based on their tactical limitations. If I can calculate their probable movements and position my aircraft accordingly, victory becomes a matter of execution rather than luck." It was an honest answer that revealed her analytical approach to aerial combat, while avoiding any details about her background or training. Petrov nodded approvingly. Mathematics and emotion, the eternal conflict in aerial warfare. Pilots, who master both elements, tend to survive longer than those who rely on either alone. The Guards Regiment flew the newest Soviet aircraft available, including the advanced Yak-3 fighters that had just entered production. These machines were faster and more heavily armed than anything Maria had flown before, but they also required more physical strength to control at high speeds. Her slight build, which had been an advantage in earlier aircraft, now became a potential limitation in the demanding cockpit environment. Her new squadron mates were all veteran aces with combat experience dating back to the earliest days of the war. They had survived situations that killed lesser pilots through a combination of skill, luck, and the kind of tactical awareness that could only be developed through hundreds of combat missions. Each one studied the new arrival with professional interest, looking for strengths and weaknesses that might affect their own survival in future battles. Major Alexei Volinsky was the most experienced pilot in the squadron, with 38 confirmed victories and a reputation for aggressive tactics. He took personal responsibility for evaluating new pilots and deciding whether they possessed the skills needed for Guards Regiment missions. His assessment would largely determine whether Victor was accepted as an equal or treated as an outsider who didn't belong among the elite. The evaluation began with formation flying exercises that tested precision and teamwork under increasingly difficult conditions. Maria flew wingmen to various pilots, demonstrating her ability to maintain position during aggressive maneuvers and respond instantly to tactical commands. Her small size actually helped in these exercises, allowing her to handle extreme gravitational forces better than larger pilots. Next came gunnery practice against towed targets and ground installations. The Guards Regiment standards were far higher than anything Maria had experienced in her previous unit. Pilots were expected to achieve precise hits while flying at high speed and pulling sharp turns that would incapacitate ordinary airmen. She passed these tests easily, her natural shooting ability adapting quickly to the more powerful weapons of the advanced fighter aircraft. The real evaluation came during her first combat mission with the Guards Regiment. Victor was assigned to fly as wingman to Major Volinsky during a fighter sweep over German-held territory. The mission was designed to locate and destroy enemy aircraft while demonstrating the new pilot's ability to function effectively as part of an elite combat team. They encountered a formation of 12 German fighters escorting a group of transport aircraft loaded with supplies for frontline units. The engagement would test every aspect of Victor's flying skills while providing Major Volinsky with direct observation of the new pilot's combat performance. It was the kind of evaluation that could make or break a career in the Guards Regiment. Maria followed Volinsky into the attack, maintaining perfect formation position while they dove toward the enemy aircraft. The German pilots were experienced and well organized, immediately turning to meet the Soviet attack with coordinated defensive maneuvers. What followed was the kind of high-speed, three-dimensional chess match that separated elite pilots from ordinary fighter pilots. Volinsky engaged the German formation leader while directing Victor to attack the fighters protecting the transport aircraft. Maria selected her targets carefully, using her superior climbing ability to position herself above the enemy formation before beginning her attack. Her first burst destroyed a Messerschmitt that was turning to engage Major Volinsky, clearing the way for her squadron mate to continue his own attack. The battle evolved rapidly as both sides maneuvered for advantage. Maria shot down 2 more German fighters while protecting Volinsky's flanks, demonstrating the kind of teamwork that kept elite pilots alive in extended combat. Her shooting was precise and economical, each burst calculated to achieve maximum effect while conserving ammunition for additional targets. When the engagement ended, 8 German aircraft had been destroyed or damaged, including all the transport planes and most of their escort fighters. The remaining enemy aircraft fled toward their own territory, leaving the sky clear for the victorious Soviet pilots. Maria had personally accounted for 4 of the victories, while providing effective support for Major Volinsky's attacks. During the debriefing, Volinsky's evaluation was unequivocal. "Victor flies like a pilot with 10 years of combat experience," he reported to Colonel Petrov. "His tactical awareness is exceptional, his shooting is deadly accurate, and his formation flying is flawless. More importantly, he thinks like a team member rather than an individual glory seeker. I recommend immediate acceptance into full combat status." That evening, the squadron held an informal celebration for Victor's successful evaluation. The other pilots shared stories about their own early experiences with the Guards Regiment and offered advice about surviving at the highest levels of aerial combat. Maria listened carefully, absorbing information about tactics and personalities that would help her function effectively within the elite unit. But even as she celebrated with her new squadron mates, Maria remained acutely aware of the increased scrutiny that came with Guards Regiment service. These pilots were not only exceptional airmen, but also politically reliable officers whose loyalty to the Soviet system had been thoroughly investigated. Any inconsistency in Victor's background or behavior would be noticed immediately and reported to the appropriate authorities. The fame that came with Guards Regiment service also brought unwanted attention from higher military and political officials. Victor's combat record was now being cited in propaganda broadcasts and newspaper articles designed to boost civilian morale. Photographs of the young pilot appeared in publications distributed throughout the Soviet Union, increasing the risk that someone who knew Maria's real identity might recognize her disguised appearance. Most dangerous of all was the growing interest from Soviet intelligence agencies in Victor's background and personal history. The NKVD maintained detailed files on all elite pilots, and any gaps or inconsistencies in their records triggered intensive investigations. Maria knew that her carefully constructed false identity would not survive professional scrutiny by trained counterintelligence specialists. She was walking a tightrope between the glory of military success and the constant threat of exposure and execution. Each victory brought her closer to the recognition she had always dreamed of as a pilot, but it also increased the likelihood that her deception would be discovered. The war continued to rage around her, but Maria's greatest battle was the daily struggle to maintain her secret identity while serving among the most elite and observant pilots in the Soviet Air Force. The moment Maria had dreaded for months finally arrived. On a cold morning in March 1943, she was summoned to Colonel Petrov's office for what was described as a routine administrative meeting, but the presence of two NKVD officers in civilian clothes made it clear that her secret had finally been discovered. Their faces were expressionless as they studied documents spread across the colonel's desk. "Sit down, Victor," Colonel Petrov said quietly. His voice carried a mixture of disappointment and something that might have been admiration. "Or should I say Maria Sergeyevna Volkova? Yes, we know your real identity. We have known for several weeks." Maria felt her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. After months of successful deception, her greatest fear was becoming reality. She remained silent, knowing that anything she said could only make the situation worse. The NKVD officers watched her with the patient attention of predators studying their prey. "The question," Petrov continued, "is what we should do with this information. According to military regulations, you have committed serious crimes by falsifying enlistment documents and maintaining a false identity while serving in the armed forces. These are offenses that normally result in immediate court-martial and execution." One of the NKVD officers leaned forward. "We have investigated your background thoroughly, Comrade Volkova. Your father was indeed a pilot, killed in a training accident when you were 16. Your brother Victor died of tuberculosis 6 months before you enlisted using his identity. Your mother believes you were working in an aircraft factory in Leningrad. Everyone who might have recognized you is either dead or serving in distant military units." Maria found her voice at last. "How long have you known?" she asked. "The medical irregularities in your records were noticed during routine file reviews," Petrov explained. "Further investigation revealed inconsistencies in your enlistment documents and personal history. However, we chose to continue surveillance rather than take immediate action because of your exceptional combat performance." The second NKVD officer spoke for the first time. "Your combat record presents us with an unusual situation, comrade. 27 confirmed aerial victories in 6 months of combat flying. You have personally destroyed more enemy aircraft than some entire squadrons manage in a year of operations. This creates political complications that go far beyond simple military discipline." Colonel Petrov stood and walked to the window, looking out at the aircraft parked on the flight line. "The Soviet Union is fighting for its survival," he said. "We cannot afford to waste resources, especially resources as valuable as exceptional combat pilots. Your gender is irrelevant compared to your ability to destroy German aircraft and protect our ground forces." Maria began to understand that this meeting was not heading toward the execution she had expected. "What are you proposing?" she asked carefully. "We are proposing to create a new identity for you," the first NKVD officer explained. "Maria Volkova, volunteer pilot serving with distinction in the Guards Fighter Regiment. Your previous service as Victor will be classified as a training period that prepared you for your true assignment. All records will be adjusted to reflect this new reality." The proposal was extraordinary, but Maria sensed there would be conditions attached. "What would be required of me in return?" she asked. Petrov turned back from the window. "You would continue flying combat missions as before, but under your true identity. More importantly, you would become a symbol of Soviet womanhood and military capability. The propaganda value of a female pilot with your combat record is enormous. You would represent the equality and strength of our socialist system. There would also be additional responsibilities," the second NKVD officer added. "Speaking engagements, interviews with journalists, appearances at military ceremonies. You would become a public figure whose image would be used to encourage other women to contribute to the war effort." Maria realized she was being offered a choice between death as a spy and life as a propaganda symbol. It was not the freedom she had dreamed of, but it would allow her to continue flying and fighting. "Would I continue serving with the Guards Regiment?" she asked. "Under my command, yes," Petrov confirmed. "Your combat effectiveness is too valuable to waste on public relations duties. You would fly missions as before, but your victories would be celebrated publicly, rather than hidden under a false identity. The Soviet people need heroes, and you have already proven yourself to be exactly that kind of hero." The transformation began immediately. Maria's personal effects were removed from the barracks and replaced with items appropriate for a female pilot. A new uniform was tailored to fit her properly, and she was assigned private quarters that provided the privacy she had been desperately seeking for months. For the first time since enlisting, She could drop the exhausting pretense of being someone else. The official announcement of her true identity created a sensation throughout the Soviet military and civilian population. Newspaper articles described the remarkable story of the young woman who had disguised herself as a man to fight for her country. Radio broadcasts praised her courage and dedication while emphasizing the advanced role of women in Soviet society compared to capitalist nations. The other pilots in the Guards Regiment reacted with a mixture of amazement and respect. Many admitted they had suspected Victor was hiding something significant, but none had imagined the truth was so dramatic. Major Volinsky summed up the general attitude when he said, "I don't care if you're a woman, a man, or a trained bear. Anyone who can shoot down German fighters the way you do is welcome on my wing." Maria's first combat mission under her true identity was emotionally overwhelming. For the first time in her military career, she was flying as herself rather than as an assumed character. The freedom of no longer maintaining a constant deception was intoxicating, but it also brought new responsibilities and pressures that she had not anticipated. The mission was a success, with Maria shooting down 2 German fighters while protecting a formation of ground attack aircraft. But the real difference was in the aftermath. Instead of quietly returning to base and filing a routine report, she was immediately surrounded by journalists and photographers documenting her achievement. Every aspect of the mission was recorded and analyzed for its propaganda value. The publicity campaign that followed transformed Maria from an anonymous pilot into a national celebrity. Her photograph appeared on recruitment posters encouraging women to join the military. Stories about her achievements were broadcast throughout the Soviet Union and published in international newspapers sympathetic to the communist cause. She became a symbol of female empowerment and Soviet military superiority. But celebrity status came with significant drawbacks. Maria's freedom of movement was restricted for security reasons, and her personal life became subject to constant scrutiny by political officers. Every statement she made was analyzed for its propaganda value and political reliability. She discovered that being a famous female pilot involved almost as much deception and careful behavior as pretending to be a man had required. More troubling was the way her new status affected her relationships with other pilots. Some treated her with excessive deference because of her political importance, while others seemed to question whether her combat victories had been exaggerated for propaganda purposes. The easy camaraderie she had enjoyed as Victor was replaced by a more formal and distant interaction with her colleagues. The war continued, and Maria flew increasingly dangerous missions against experienced German pilots who had been specifically briefed about the famous Soviet female ace. Enemy intelligence services had identified her as a high-value target, worth significant effort to eliminate. Every combat engagement now carried the additional risk that she was being specifically hunted by the Luftwaffe's best pilots. Despite these challenges, Maria continued to achieve remarkable combat success. Her victory total climbed steadily as she shot down German aircraft with the same deadly efficiency she had demonstrated as Victor. By the end of 1943, she was credited with 43 confirmed aerial victories, making her one of the highest-scoring Allied pilots of the entire war. The young woman who had disguised herself as a farm boy to fulfill her dream of flying had become something she never expected, a symbol of courage and determination whose story inspired millions of people fighting against fascism. But she had also learned that achieving her dreams came with responsibilities and costs that she could never have imagined when she first climbed into her father's crop-dusting aircraft as a child. As the war moved toward its eventual conclusion, Maria continued flying combat missions while serving as a living example of what determination and skill could accomplish against impossible odds. Her secret had been revealed, but her real identity as one of the war's greatest pilots was finally being celebrated rather than hidden. The girl who had pretended to be someone else had discovered that being herself was the greatest victory of all. Years later, when historians analyzed the aerial campaigns of the Second World War, Maria Volkova's name would be remembered alongside the greatest pilots of any nation. But those who knew her personally would remember not just her combat achievements, but her courage in fighting 2 wars simultaneously, one against the German Air Force, and another against the social expectations that tried to keep her on the ground. She had won both battles through the simple refusal to accept that her dreams were impossible to achieve.